It's always an honor to offer a teaching or a perspective. And this particular Shabbat offers a lot to consider. There's a special name to this Shabbat. I haven't said it yet, but I should say it now. This is called Shabbat Chazon. And Shabbat Chazon, we read the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Parshat Devarim, and it leads into Tisha B'Av, which comes up this Thursday. So what can I teach you about Deuteronomy? One thing that seems to occur to me often as someone who reads from the Torah scroll is that when we translate the first word of the Parsha, it doesn't really make a lot of sense in English. Deuteronomy is not English, it's Greek. Devarim is Hebrew. And Devarim in Hebrew translates as words. Words. Why are words so important? Well, if you aren't too sure, perhaps I'll convince you as I talk. So this particular book in the Torah scroll contains the last words of Moshe in the last month of his life, the greatest prophet of the Jewish tradition. And the fact that it always precedes Tisha B'Av is no mistake. Tisha B'Av is one of the greatest tragedies of Jewish history. It changed everything. Everything. Patrick wouldn't have those beautiful trope sounds that are different than mine if we hadn't all dispersed all over the world so long ago and developed our own nuances in our beautiful tradition. The book itself marks a shift. We're entering this new land with a new generation. If you remember, towards the end of the last book, we were reading about how, unfortunately, those who had fled Egypt had just messed up too many times, and they weren't able to take on the joy of freedom in the right way or to follow God's words. And so a new generation has come, led by Kalev ben Yefuneh and Yehoshua ben Nun. The two spies went out into the land and saw that it was good. And so things are changing again. When I look at Tisha B'Av as a pivotal point in Jewish history, I see the same echo in the Parsha today. And so the new land, we're going to go and hopefully take it over. We know how that story ends. I don't like reading about war, even if it's, forgetting a new land. It's a tough read in Deuteronomy sometimes, and there's a new generation to claim this inheritance that had been promised to the Jewish people. And Moshe has to recap a lot of the teachings from earlier on in the Torah scroll and make sure that Bnei Israel is on the same page, knowing where we're going into the future. It's interesting to note that some of the people on the path to Yisrael are not to be attacked. Not all the land is for us to take over. We're not really a warlike people. We needed a land at that point in time in history, and we went out and we claimed it. But there were some people who were off limits. Esav's descendants are to keep their land, and there are others in the neighborhood. So, eventually, the Torah scroll ends in the book of Deuteronomy, but we aren't quite there yet. Now, you may have heard the word Eicha echoed in this parsha, right? The word Eicha is the Hebrew name for the book of Lamentations. It's echoed in one verse of the Torah reading that Tali read that part this morning. I believe it's verse 12. It's echoed in the Haftarah that we read this morning. But what does it mean? What does it mean? Well, how can I carry on? Eicha. How can I carry on? When everything's so hard, how can I carry on? Without the temple, how did we carry on? It's also interesting to note that there's a similar word, same letters in the Torah. It's Eicha. And Eicha means where are you? Or where are we? Morally, what have we learned? So the temple's destroyed. It's about the year 70. How do we carry on? It's unclear. And then there's this very fascinating story that comes up if you look into it about Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. This story sounds like it should be a movie. So he's in Jerusalem. Everything's under siege by the Romans. And he realizes it's a lost cause. He could stay and fight, but they're not going to win it. And he doesn't want it to be the end. Now, the Romans aren't letting anybody leave either. So he goes in a coffin He pretends he's dead, and he gets smuggled out by his students. And he asks them to smuggle him all the way to a Roman general named Vespasian. And he negotiates in a very, perhaps controversial move of the time. I can tell you Rabbi Akiva did not agree with this move, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai found a new way forward. He negotiates with Vespasian a move to Yavneh, which is a small community of scholars on the coast, and founds Rabbinic Judaism. So, what do we do now? We've come from a nation of priests, of kings, and suddenly we're a nation of scholars trying to find a new way. And this is where, to my mind, Devarim, words, become really important. It's often occurred to me as a Jewish person that Jewish people all over the world have, well, a few things in common, but the big one is the Torah scroll. We are meticulous in our scribing of the Torah scroll. Every letter must be exact. If there is a letter that is not correct, the reader shouts, Pasul! It needs to be corrected, it needs to be fixed. Why? Because if there was one changed letter every generation, our story would have drastically changed by now. But it has not changed. It remains the same. In Deuteronomy, we're going to read the Ten Commandments next week. You'll find the Shema Yisrael. You'll find all the highlights of those words that have linked us through time for thousands of years. And so Rabbinic Judaism flourished. However, we went from a culture that went to the temple and conducted sacrifices to a culture that put the emphasis on gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, and charity as being more acceptable to God and more desirable to God than sacrifice. And the rest is history. Here we are, almost 2,000 years later, gathered at Shul, and it's my honor to remind us all of why. And why I am so drawn to Torah study and to chanting the really old texts really well. Because that is what has linked us throughout time until the present, and what will sustain us in the future, as long as we remember why and how to read them, why they're important, where they come from. Our tradition has a beautiful, beautiful intertextuality to it. The more literate you are in the text, the more you realize different texts are referring to each other all the time. The Torah appears in a prayer from later, right? There's a line of Torah. And the more you study, the more you learn, the more you realize what a long chain we belong to. And so this morning, in preparation for Tisha B'Av, reading the book of Lamentations, as a congregation, it was my honor to help us all remember this morning, along with Bill and Alice and Jerome and Bonnie, that we haven't always had music. We were mourning for a very long time. And now, we're hitting a new phase in Judaism. We're evolving again. But here's the thing, we've made it this far not because we've stayed the same. We've made it this far because we remember where we came from, and we're still wrestling with the texts. We're wrestling with the whys and the ethics. And so it'll be interesting to see what this next generation of Jewish practice brings with us and how it evolves for the future. Shabbat Shalom.